So let's talk through some of the very strongest datasheets in Warhammer 40K, with a look at 10 of the best in the game right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk through a few of the most powerful units in the game of 40k as a whole. As it goes, deciding on absolute power of units can mean really quite a lot of different things, and in reality it's all a little bit nebulous. It doesn't generally tend to be strength of any one model that actually matters in game, more as to how powerful they are in the army overall with all their support and working with the other options they have. And it's also kind of expected that some armies will have units that are very good at doing certain things but have weaknesses in some areas, and the same will be true of other factions. You might also be comparing things like mainline damage dealers with action and objective type units, so it's sort of hard to compare things doing completely different purposes. In general though, for datasheets that are considered to be incredibly strong in Warhammer 40k, I feel like it often tends to be named characters or datasheets with special rules that have kind of diminishing returns. Arguably for their armies, they can afford to be a little bit more overpowered, as it means that you're not usually going to spam out an entire army worth of them. And just because something is auto-include within a faction in competitive lists doesn't necessarily mean that it's too strong in the context of the game overall. For this video, I'll try and broadly go with providing some of the most value per point, looking at both some big expensive and some cheaper units. Obviously this one's going to be very arbitrary, and I could have happily made a list that looks really quite different, focusing on different units. So I'll try and quickly round up a whole bunch of other near misses in the Honourable Mentions section at the end. In any case though, let's go through 10 of the strongest units in Warhammer 40k. Not going in any particular order, as I don't really think it makes sense for this, but datasheets or unit combos that are unquestionably strong for their factions. First up, I thought we'd start small with Orc Gretchin, which might seem like an unusual choice, but if every faction could access this unit for 40 points, I feel like they'd be basically auto-include for literally every army in the game, and you can't really say that about too many things. Tiny units in Warhammer 40k have absolutely got good value all of their own. They're cheap and expendable and can do actions and can scream with a good footprint for these guys, seeing as they've got 11 models in the squad. And on top of that, unlike quite a few of the absolute chaff infantry units, they actually have really good objective control as well. 11 objective control 2 bodies does mean that they actually will need to be destroyed if you want to take the objective they're on. And while some units will do that pretty easily, several units just won't be able to do that in one turn just because they lack the number of attacks or number of average hits they'll get, even if most converted hits wind up in a dead grot. They're pretty perfect for guarding the home field, and their leadership isn't even as terrible as you might expect, with the Ronto to keep them in line for his leadership 7. The main reason they're better than just standard chaff though is their special rule. Each turn they get the chance to rustle up a command point if they're sat on an objective, on a 4+ chance to gain one. So that means over the course of the game, in theory land, you get around about 2 or 3 command points in total, though in reality you might have a bit of overlap by gaining them with other sources like dropping secondary objectives that you can't do. I think this tips them from already being kind of solidly usable as a cheap annoying units to hold objectives to kind of ridiculous standout value for 40 points. Even getting a single bonus command point could easily equate to around about 40 points of in-game value if used on the right stratagem at the right time. Even things like a fun Overwatch with flash kits or a random tank shock could give a good chunk of that value. Never mind more high impact stratagems like re-rolling a failed charge that just fell short, or a heroic intervention or something. As a result, they're an auto-include to the extent where most units aren't, and I feel like just about every single army in the game would probably take 1 or 2 squads of them if they had access to such a unit. A nuisance squad to sit on the home field, maybe you could have one advancing towards the midboard to try and hide in cover on an objective, and have a chance to rustle up some command points each turn. Next up for the Astra Militarum, we've got Lord Solar Leontus, 125 points for perhaps the game's single best buffing character. A kind of ridiculous force multiplier that will often be sat in the middle of an Astra Militarum army, with good synergy with some of the most competitive units that they have. Again, like the Gretchin, just generating a command point a turn is really reliable. Occasionally it might have overlap with some discarded objectives that you might have gained command points for anyway, but just kind of powerful and reliable that you know that you're getting an extra command point each turn. It makes 2 command point stratagems like Fields of Fire and Reinforcements feel a bit easier to justify perhaps. Beyond that though, he gets 3 godly orders that can affect things like tank commanders, Borgrin and super heavies, and that also makes him the most efficient source of tank orders as well, given that you can only get 2 with a tank commander if you give them Grand Strategist. So if you want him to order regular Lehman Russes or Rogol Dawns and things, again he's probably one of the best choices there. He'll often be found sat at the back with a command squad with a Master Vox tied together with an infantry squad of some sort, and that means that he can broadcast those great orders through the Master Vox and affect things anywhere up to 24 inches away. It's really big to be able to have big threatening units like Rogol Dawn tanks being able to move all over the board and still being able to get their 3+ to hit, or Bulgarians moving 9 inches before charging if you give them move. Otherwise beyond that he's got pretty reasonable damage and defense stats, fairly similar to a Space Marine captain, so late game he can push out and hopefully deal a bit of damage to some medium infantry if it matters. And then as if all the synergy already wasn't enough, you can also redeploy 3 units and put them in reserves if you need to. That can be handy to make sure that your tanks get the jump on the enemy damage dealers, for example, maybe just tweaking some positions so that if the enemy goes first they don't have an easy line of sight to something really important once both sides' deployments are revealed. Overall thoroughly awesome for 125 points, well worth supporting with a command squad and infantry squad as well, and not hard to see why it's in the vast majority of competitive Astra Militarum lists. Just as a quick aside before we move on, if you'd like to support the channel when you're picking up plastic miniatures and get a discount versus Games Workshop's web store, I do have a bunch of discount affiliate links in the video description. Links to a whole bunch of official 40k discount retailers around the world. In the UK there's Element Games usually for 15 to 20% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21%, Feminist Workshop in Canada for 10% off, Wargame Portal in the USA for 15%, and Taschengeldieb in Germany and the EU for around 16 to 20%. A saving like that can add up to quite a bit in the long run over the course of a 40k collection given how expensive they are. And as always a massive thank you to any of you guys choosing to support the channel when you do pick up miniatures anyway. Moving on though, next up we've got some godly spotting units for the greater good with the Tau Empire stealth suits. It's kind of weird that they're sort of baked in to being absolutely vital to how the Tau deal damage right now. Perhaps a slightly odd situation, but certainly I feel like if the vast majority of factions in Warhammer 40k could get a cheap infiltrating unit with the ability to put such a massive damage boost on your biggest scariest units around, they'd absolutely jump at the chance. At base the unit costs 60 points and has 3 models at toughness 4 with 2 wounds, stealth to help ward off a little bit of enemy firepower, and just in general low cost infiltrating units are usually pretty good just in their own right, being in the right place to contest primaries and doing actions and secondaries when they need to. They do have a little bit of their own threat with burst cannons and fusion blasters, though it's not like that's the main role for them. In general though, their infiltrating role can often be superseded just with the need to buff the big scary Tau units out there. They're already quite a nice cheap unit that you don't mind spotting things with, so that gives the guided unit a +1 ballistic skill and also ignores cover when they take their marker drone along. But then on top of that, the Tau stealth suits of course give you reroll 1s to hit and to wound as well. And even if it had just been one or the other, they probably would have been the preferred marking choice. But with both, that's kind of a damage boost that you can't really ignore. For the Tau units without rerolls, that's a big 36% damage buff, never mind the actual core guiding bonus. As a result, you basically see 3 units of 3 of them in just about every competitive list. That's between a fairly spectacular damage boost and good utility with infiltrating if it makes sense to. It just feels pretty impossible to go wrong with less than 200 points for 3 units of them. While they're doing their guiding job, they might be able to do other things like positional secondaries, and they do have a couple of other synergies as well, things like potential free rapid ingress if it makes sense with crisis suits if you want to, and also the Kauyon detachment with Wall of Mirrors, which could allow them to jump around behind the enemy in the later stages of the game. Next up we've got the Sisters of Battle with the Triumph of St. Katherine. Sisters are one of the strongest armies in Warhammer 40k right now, and perhaps out of all of their great options, the Triumph of St. Katherine seems to be one of the single most auto-includes. 190 points for a great slightly mad funeral procession with a bunch of fun relics and some fairly amazing buffing rules. The model itself has 18 wounds with a 3+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, and the infantry keyword to be able to have good interactions with ruins. Its damage output isn't the main point, but it's certainly not a non-factor. 18 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1 is enough to bully lighter and medium infantry and melee, scrape off some objective grabbers from the midboard perhaps. The single biggest thing about it that changed in the codex was the 1 free auto 6 miracle dice per turn, which is an ability worth a staggering amount of points just in itself. At the start of each battle round you get an extra miracle dice and it's an automatic 6, so basically guarantees that it will be a useful one. The 6 dice often being worth far more than any of the rest that you can have on offer. You can plug it into automatic 6 melter shots, so say a multi-melter within melter range can guarantee 8 damage on a tank if you sneak a single wound through saves. If all that matters is just literally getting the wound and then your opponent doesn't have a good invulnerable save and you want to guarantee just some damage, you could feed it into an automatic lethal hit for a multi-melter, say if you had a Palatine perhaps, or an automatic wound of a 6, presuming that you hit at least 1 shot out of the unit. Again, that's pretty great at guaranteeing damage and helps get around the melter weapon sometimes wounding on a 5 against really tough stuff. It's also massive movement as well. You can guarantee long advances to get onto objectives or long charges when they're going to be crucial. It could really help the threat range of something absolutely devastating getting into melee, say more than Vaal and Paragon warsuits. And you could also use it on saves where it makes sense as well. Say for example a Castigator has a 6+ invulnerable save. You could get shot by something like a Guard Vanquisher cannon with d6 plus 6 damage and just make that damage instantly go away by automatically passing your invulnerable save 6. Basically loads of really powerful options there, with the onus on the Sisters player to choose the ones that is going to most coordinate them to win the game overall. I'd say that's the single best ability that it has, but it does also come with a lot of other good buffing rules that it gets to pick 2 of each turn. In the early game, the +2 to move and then +1 to advance and charge can be big for rushing things, maybe bringing things like Immolators with Melters and Flamers into damage range pretty much from turn 1 if you want to. Maybe the same for Seraphim and Hand Flamers, or delivering things to melee. Otherwise, beyond that, for the rest of the game, when the main army gets stuck in, you can get some Feel No Pain, shooting or melee buffs, doubling up Acts of Faith if there's a good combo to go ahead, or falling back to warding off Battle Shock if that's all that matters to make sure that you score objectives. Again, lots of very strong options, at least some of which will be pretty guaranteed to add at least some value to your army. Even just getting reroll wounds of 1 and a Feel No Pain on Castigators isn't awful though. Overall, it might cost a fair few points, but it's kind of ridiculous in the amount of value that it brings for them. Next up, we're on to the Chaos Demons, and for most cost-effective units in 40k, I think it's hard not to talk about the Great Unclean one with Endless Gift. Pretty well also include for them, and just really bad news to see on the other side of the tabletop, as I feel like just about no army can really trade out particularly well with this guy. The amount of damage that you need to bring him down is just so obscene that it's probably not worth bothering with, not versus attacking literally anything else in the army, so he's just going to stomp around, cause problems, contest objectives, and bully medium infantry. For his stat line, he's toughness 12 with 20 wounds with a 4+ invulnerable save, a 6+ Feel No Pain at base, but that goes up to a 4+ Feel No Pain for 30 points with Endless Gift, effectively doubling the average wounds that you need to take off him. So to kill this 260 point beast, you'd expect to have to get 40 wounds through at toughness 12 with that 4+ invulnerable. So effectively around about 7 points per wound at toughness 12 with a 4+ invulnerable, which is just crazy. He can then march up the board towards the centre of it, chip away at enemy units between his Vomit, Flail and Bile Sword. If the enemy has some medium infantry within range, he should flatten a fair number of them each turn. He isn't going to be crazily good against tough monsters and vehicles, but at the same time he will still chip damage turn on turn. He can also debuff a unit within 12 inches for -1 toughness, so good synergy with other units in the army. Provides an aura of Shadow of Chaos for Nurgle, including boosted stratagems and all sorts of other goodness. A 6+ Feel No Pain for Demons of Nurgle if you happen to have them in the front ranks as well. I could even do some shenanigans like the 3-inch Deep Strike redeploy. If the opponent lets you, having this guy just suddenly turn up in your own deployment zone to annoy your objective holders is probably going to be bad news. Basically at his current points cost, I feel like it's impossible to go too far wrong with, and it's cheap enough that even if he winds up just battling his way through waves of chaff each turn, that's not even the end of the world. It's likely going to be the best outcome for the opponent, compared with actually letting him get into important stuff or actually trying to kill him. Next up, and sticking with the Chaos, we've got Magnus of the Thousand Suns, an army doing incredibly well in the competitive game at the moment, and he's the absolute linchpin with the ability to just fly very far and do obscene amounts of damage, plus also buffing the rest of the army. Magnus is 440 points, he moves fast at 14 inches and can use his own buff for a +2 inches to the move if it makes sense, and then potentially if he just needs some ridiculous speed to get the jump on something, he could use the Kabbalistic Ritual to double his move. So you could have him move 32 inches and fly basically all the way over to get line of sight on things the opponent thought might have been safe. When he gets there, he can hit them with enormous sorcery. The profiles for the Gaze of Magnus and Tzeentch's Firestorm are kind of merely okay on their own, but given that he gets +1 to hit and wound with his own buffs, the detachment rule of either sustains lethal or devastating each turn, and it's a great target for the full rerolls to hit and wounds just to double down on all the pain. There's a good chance that between the two of them they can one-round things like most normal units and battle tanks. Very scary to be able to threaten that amount of carnage after double moving 32 inches. His durability is really quite good, though I'd say not standout for 440 points. It's more the case that he's just going to be hard to take down, as all that investment comes in one big solid mass. Most armies won't be able to kill him in one turn. He's got 16 wounds with a 4+ invulnerable save, usually -1 damage from his own debuff, and then if needed, he can blank a damage for 1 command point after he's failed the save. And that could be very good value if you say had a big gun tank that had an enormous damage shot that did get lucky. Then after all that, he's got solid melee with 7 attacks at strength 16, AP 3 and damage 3, again with +1 to hit and wound as if he really needed it, and a sweep mode to take down hordes as well. And he also acts as a force multiplier, buffing nearby psychic damage, quite good for the battery of spells coming out of various sorcerers. He'll also give you 4 Kabbalistic ritual points as well, it definitely doesn't hurt either. Overall he does cost a lot of points, that's definitely a model that could be a bit of a win or lose model for how he gets played over the course of the game, but certainly it pretty much auto-include for the 1000 Suns, and carrying a good chunk of the damage for an army that's doing one of the best in 40k. Next up, and taking a look at the Dark Angels, I thought I'd mention the Deathwing Knights for this one. A bit more of a standard damage and defense type unit, but one that absolutely seems to be tearing it up at top tournament level, often with 2 or 3 units included in a whole bunch of competitive lists. The Elite of the Unforgiven being able to go toe to toe with just about anything. They're 235 points for 5 of them, and are pretty much the tankiest Terminators in the game. 4 wounds at toughness 5 with a 4+ invulnerable save, and -1 damage built in, so you need a damage 5 hit to puncture their saves to be able to kill one of them. They can use Armour of Contempt if they get hit by weapons of sort of middling AP, plus the option for cover as well, and have the Watcher in the Dark for a 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds once per game, which definitely doesn't hurt given that that's one of the best ways to kill them, with the last balance pass giving them fairly brutal damage output as well. They're just now in a position to just march up the board and be incredibly intimidating to remove, and then also take down the majority of medium-sized units in a single round of combat. Most people take the great weapon, though beyond that there's plenty of love for both the power swords and the maces. Just with average rolling hitting on their 2+, they kill around about 15 termagants, 8 intercessors, 3 or 4 enemy terminators, or around about 12 wounds to a rhino or predator tank. So basically neither a unit that the opponent can really afford to ignore nor kill very easily. They get on very well with the Dark Angels Gladius formation that seems to be their competitive way to win tournaments at the moment. Advance and charge helps these get to melee and helps cover one of their biggest weaknesses, which is actually getting there. Plus to have access to that lance and better AP stratagem if they need it, which could be quite nice for the power weapon ones in particular. Sticking with the Death Guard and just being very good value all around for what he does is Typhus, maybe not so very complicated in what he brings to the table. A chunky and scary Terminator that's just got good stats already for the 80 points, strong defense in his own right, really quite nice attack with 5 attacks at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 3 with lethal hits, and that'll often be AP 3 from contagions, and always -1 toughness on the enemy as well, so you wound things like toughness 10 vehicles on a 4+. All of that just makes him into a good beat stick character in the first place, but taking him to the next level is his mortal wound attack. For the Eater Plague he just gets to choose one unit within 18 inches, roll a dice, and on a 2+ they take D6 mortal wounds, with a small chance to get D3+3 if you roll a big 6. Even if you're just able to use that maybe 2 or 3 times per game, you've probably justified his points cost with around 10 or so mortal wounds overall. Never mind anything that he does in melee, or the fact that he gives you a -1 to hit in melee for his lead unit, and it even has a bit of weird utility as one of the only ones out of these abilities that can still target lone operatives despite being greater than 12 inches away from them. With that kind of profile between his damage and defense, literally any way that you want to use him is pretty much fine. Most commonly he tends to go alongside Death Shroud Terminators, just adding up to a very scary melee unit overall that should be able to take big chunks out of whatever they charge into. You could make an interesting and cheap but very dangerous Hordy unit for Poxwalkers, have 20 of them plus him marching up the board. I've occasionally seen people just using him super cheap as a sort of solo objective grabber type unit, deep striking with a single base and throwing out some mortal wounds while he does say a secondary action like behind enemy lines or establish locus and things. Overall he'd still be a strong unit if he was a fair bit more expensive than this. The Grey Knights very much enjoy their Brotherhood Librarians in a very similar Terminator character with the same kind of mortal wound attack, and they see loads of play despite being 120 points rather than 80. Next up I thought we'd go for another 1000 Suns one, this time being the rather terrifying combo of Rubrics with Warp Flamers plus the Infernal Master, probably being just about the scariest torrent weapon unit in the entire game, and well capable of burning down anything that ventures onto a mid-board objective. The Rubric Marines are 105 points for 5 of them, taking a Warp Flame pistol on the Sorcerer, 3 of them taking Warp Flamers, and the last one likely going for a Soul Reaper cannon that you could just run them with maximal Warp Flamers if desired, and there you get a whole bunch of spammed Strength 4, AP 1, Damage 1 attacks with Ignore Cover, re-rolling all wounds against things on objectives, or wound rolls of 1 against things that aren't on them. That's already really quite fearsome, and they've got access to an extra 2 AP when they need it, via a Kabbalistic Ritual if you're feeling spendy, and a pretty well guaranteed stat loads of saves on enemy units that try and take objectives, and maybe even get a bunch of devastating wounds from the Soul Reaper as well. Then add in an Infernal Master to the mix, and he throws out 2d6 attacks at Strength 6, AP 2 and Damage 1 with Torrent. Those attacks can benefit from the Rubric's rule, re-rolling wound rolls of 1 or all wound rolls against things taking objectives, and that fairly good base stat line can go up in a number of different ways. Arcane Vortex can make it Damage 2 and Strength 7. He can automatically make one of the wound rolls an automatic 6 as well after rolling, and he could potentially use the detachment rule to get devastating wounds as well if one of the sustained or lethal hits isn't needed for Magnus himself. In particular, the devastating wounds plus the automatic 6 means that you could get an automatic damage 2 devastating wound through from the Arcane Vortex one straight away. Never mind anything else that comes out of all those attacks with the rerolls. And they can basically all do this again on Overwatch as well, meaning that the opponents have to think very hard as to whether or not they want to move anything up to take the mid-board objective, which in 40k you can't really afford to not do so if you want to get primary points, forcing them into a pretty tricky situation. The squad doesn't really have the craziest defense stats for the cost, though the Rubrics aren't awful with their 5+ invulnerable save, but just the sheer damage, the good objective control, and the massive Overwatch threat make them incredibly scary to approach. Finally, for the big 10 that I thought I'd mention, we'll go for another Demon Primarch. Angron of the World Eaters is another big scary ball of death for one of 40k's stronger factions right now, appearing in just about every army. His defensive stats are adequate enough. Toughness 16 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save. Not crazy for the 415 points he costs, but certainly not bad. The scary bit is maybe more his massive threat range. He rushes at you with his base 14-inch move, and if you combine the Blessings of Khorne with an automatic 6 advanced stratagem, it basically means that Angron can move a guaranteed 22 inches by auto-advancing 6 and also adding +2 to his movement characteristic, and then still go on to charge after that. So it's perfectly possible that if the opponent doesn't deploy really quite far back, you could have a very easy charge from one deployment zone to the next. It doesn't necessarily mean that he does have to go gung-ho turn 1 as well. He could move up into the mid-board and just threaten to do that just about wherever turn 2. When he gets there, he kills most things in a single round of combat, 9 attacks at strength 17, AP 4 and damage d6 +2 on the charge, lightly re-rolling all hits from his own buff. He's got a good sweep mode as well, and he could have a bunch of other damage or defensive buffs from the Blessings of Khorne if you don't need to plug them into sheer speed this turn. Then though, perhaps the single biggest deal is that if he does get slain, if you roll a 666 on the Blessings of Khorne, then you can use that to resurrect him. He'll come back in your next turn in the reinforcement step and likely use his +1 to charge benefits to charge out of reserve. An 8-inch charge with a 1 command point reroll gives you around about a 66% chance to get in, so a pretty solid chance he can do all of that crazy violence all over again to something new. It's certainly not guaranteed that he'll be able to get that kind of resurrection every single game, even with things like Berserker or Jackal rerolls for holding objectives, but there's a high enough chance that it's very possible if he dies at least somewhat early in the game, and if he does just come back with full wounds remaining, it could well be a game-winning thing right then and there. The opponent having to chew through another 400 points worth of incredibly dangerous Demon Primarch as he goes about destroying their biggest and best units. Again, overall, he's just a unit that's pretty much impossible to go too far wrong with. Enough speed that he's going to be able to catch something important in the enemy army, and if not, there's a good chance it means that they're just playing so defensively they might be backing off the midfield objectives and things. He can soak up a bunch of fire for the rest of the army, and then have a good chance to make all of that commitment and destroying him worthless as he comes back. Otherwise though, as mentioned at the start, there's all sorts of other things that I could have pretty much credibly included on a top 10 list, so let's go through a few of them now quickfire. Canis Rex for the Imperial Knights gets his free stratagems, enough melee to outfight a Gallant, and a big shooting threat with the sustained hits Las Impulsor he has, pretty great either in core knights or even as allies. The Nightbringer for the Necrons is enormous stats and enormous damage, again fairly hard to go wrong with just moving towards the mid-board and breaking things. All the other Katana are still good, maybe particularly the Transcendent and the Void Dragon. The Tau Riptide usually gets included in multiples in most armies. Really nice that it can fall back and shoot so it can use its good defensive profile on the front line, and its damage output, while not being spectacular, is still going to take big chunks out of enemy elite valuable infantry. Benatari Custodians with rapid ingress can drop down somewhere safe-ish turn 2 and turn 3 and then take the fight to the enemy with fast-moving jump packs and the Lance keyword on their Guardian Spears. Very powerful to have Custodians that you basically know are going to get the first strike and even get boosted damage when they do so, well worth the small points premium. And the Achilles Ridge Runner for the Genestealer cult is again a unit that just does kind of well on all fronts. really quite fast, and scouts, potentially genuinely good damage with its mining laser that's one of the better sources of anti-tank fire in the army. They can use the mortar to put its debuff out of range, and then of course its debuff is the biggest thing, handing out an extra bit of AP against enemy units at range and in melee, something that's going to be helpful to most of the army. The sisters kind of need a slide all to themselves, more than violent paragons are just ridiculous levels of destruction against monsters and vehicles, or basically anything in the game. The challenge is to get them there. Seraphim and the Caroness in Bringers of Flame for all the devastating wound flame shots in the world. The Castigator is just solid and reliable firepower, again handing out an AP debuff to help the rest of the army as well. And Dominions in Immolators and Bringers of Flame can get a whole bunch of special weapons and nastiness right to the front line very quickly indeed. Very powerful close range fire there and get on well with the rest of the detachment. I feel like the Guard have some really standout datasheets, the Rogel Dawn battle tank for sheer damage and defense, Bulgrins for problematic levels of tankiness, and then a whole bunch of volume melee attacks. And I might throw in the Tempestus Aquilons as well, with 90 points for a 3-inch drop unit, and particularly one that could be recycled with reinforcements for 2 command points as well. For the Dark Angels, I could have happily talked about Azrael and maybe Inner Circle Companions too. The Chapter Master himself, though, is always great value with a 4+ invulnerable save, a good damage buff in sustained hits, farming command points, and a good melee profile. Lots of stuff for 105. Space Wolf Thunderwolves and their support characters are good enough to carry the army, particularly in Stormlands. Jump Intercessors are really great value for the Space Marines at 80 points, often appearing in a lot of competitive lists, and maybe notably great in Blood Angels, where they can get the +2 strength and the extra attacks. Over there, they're both a great utility unit and genuinely a fairly scary damage dealer too. And for the Black Templars, I'd probably give it to Helbrecht plus Sword Brethren for the mention. They cost a fair few points, but kind of crazy that with a fully buffed squad, just literally 5 of them and Helbrecht can solo the vast majority of things in Warhammer 40K between both of their buffs. Finally, for a bit more Xenos and Chaos, for the Drukhari, maybe the Incubi and Archon combo is most worthy of a shout out. Fairly terrifying for that little unit to fly across the board, jump out and charge you from extreme distances, and then have enough damage with a pain token and lance keywords to bring down most things. The Archon's command point debuff can be handy after that as well. Eldari Warp Spiders can complete secondary objectives in a way that most things can't. They pay a premium for the massive 24-inch jump, but being able to do that with their devastating wound torrent flamers is rather nice too. As if we hadn't talked enough about the Thousand Suns, the Mutlith Vortex Beast is spectacular for 150 points. A great big gun that can be a damage d6 plus 6 shot, or flex to other profiles better against other things. Fairly tough with its feel no pain, a bit of melee and mortal wounds, and even allowing you to throw out a Doom Bolt to crazy long ranges when you need to. Finally for the Chaos Knights, I'd say the Wardog Carnivore is worth mentioning too. A single datasheet that alongside the Brigand is basically carrying the faction to any sort of success, but moving very fast, hitting really hard in close combat and having good objective control all just make it all around standout, so much so that they're very commonly included in other Chaos armies even if they don't have the synergies from the actual Knight Codex. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know your thoughts as to which units you'd rank the strongest in Warhammer 40k right now, which would make your top 10, and are there any ones that I didn't mention that deserved an honourable shout out? As mentioned, feel free to check out the discount links down in the video description if you do happen to be picking up any miniatures in the near future. And a big thank you to any of you guys supporting the channel by buying through them if you were getting something anyway. If you've enjoyed, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying it, as well as the discount links, there's also the channel Patreon page in the video description. That has a few fun bits as well, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.